A waitress approached a millionaire and told him not to close a deal with his best friend. The next morning, there was a luxury car near her humble home. The warm hum of the restaurant buzzed with conversations, laughter, and the clinking of cutlery. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, his tailored suit impeccable as always. He had just concluded another spirited discussion with Hugo, his business partner of over a decade. The two had spent countless nights at this very table, fine-tuning plans and strategies that had turned their once small startup into a thriving enterprise. Tonight was no different, or so Eduardo thought. Camilla adjusted her apron and balanced a tray of drinks as she approached their table. She had grown used to the pair of them, charming Eduardo, who tipped generously and always addressed her by name, and Hugo, whose sharp gaze and brusque demeanor gave little room for small talk. Their presence added a kind of gravitas to the modest restaurant, and the staff often speculated about the magnitude of their success. As Camilla cleared their empty plates, her attention was caught by Hugo's tense demeanor. His phone buzzed incessantly, and with a curt nod to Eduardo, he excused himself from the table, stepping toward a quieter corner. The words that followed weren't meant for her ears, but the restaurant's acoustics and her proximity betrayed him. After the deal closes, Eduardo won't see it coming. The accounts are set and the paperwork's ready. Just follow through on your end. Camilla froze. Her breath quickened as Hugo's voice grew firmer, his tone calculated. We've waited too long for this. He trusts me, and that's exactly why this plan will work. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't one to meddle in others' business, but this sounded serious, dangerous even. She finished clearing the table, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the tray on the counter. As Hugo returned, his confident smile was back, as though he hadn't just orchestrated the betrayal of his closest friend. Eduardo, oblivious, greeted him with a grin and resumed their conversation. Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Later that evening, as Eduardo was signing the check, Camilla hesitated near the register. Her instincts urged her to stay out of it, but a stronger voice, one she rarely listened to, pushed her forward. Taking a deep breath, she approached their table. "Mr. Eduardo," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, puzzled but polite. "Yes, Camilla? Everything okay?" She glanced at Hugo, whose attention was momentarily elsewhere. "Could I speak to you alone for a moment?" Eduardo frowned but nodded, intrigued. He excused himself and followed her to the side, his expression turning serious. "I don't know how to say this, but I overheard something," Camilla said, her words spilling out in a rush. "Your partner, Hugo, he was on the phone earlier. He mentioned a plan to betray you, something about accounts and paperwork." Eduardo's brows furrowed, and for a moment he seemed to be weighing her words. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She recounted the conversation as best as she could, her nerves threatening to betray her. Eduardo listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he let out a deep sigh. "That's quite an accusation," he said, his tone measured. "Hugo and I have been friends for years. He's practically family. Are you sure about what you heard?" "I'm sure," she said, her gaze steady despite her fear. "I wouldn't have come to you if I wasn't." Eduardo nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had built his empire alongside Hugo, trusting him implicitly. Could it all have been a facade? He didn't want to believe it, but something in Camilla's eyes told him she wasn't lying. "Thank you, Camilla," he said finally. "I'll look into it." She exhaled, relieved but still uneasy. "I just thought you should know. Be careful." As Eduardo returned to the table, he forced a smile and picked up the conversation as though nothing had happened. But inside, doubts churned like a storm. If Hugo was truly plotting against him, he would need proof, and he would need it fast. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt a crack in the foundation of his carefully built world, and he knew that if Camilla's warning was true, the fallout would be catastrophic. Eduardo left the restaurant that evening with a pleasant smile, masking the turmoil brewing inside him. The city's skyline glimmered under the night sky as his driver weaved through traffic, but he barely noticed. Camilla's words echoed in his mind. Hugo wouldn't betray me, would he? By the time he reached his penthouse, Eduardo had made up his mind. He couldn't risk ignoring this. If Camilla was wrong, Hugo would never know he doubted him. If she was right, Eduardo shuddered at the thought of what that could mean for his company and his reputation. The next morning, Eduardo made a call to Pablo Ortega, a private investigator known for his discretion and razor-sharp instincts. "Pablo, I need your help," Eduardo said as soon as the line connected. "This stays between us. I'll explain everything in person." 2 hours later, Pablo sat across from Eduardo in a sleek conference room, his notepad already filled with scribbles. His sharp eyes betrayed his curiosity, but he let Eduardo tell the story without interruption. When Eduardo finished, Pablo leaned back in his chair. "If what the waitress overheard is true, this isn't just a betrayal. This is corporate sabotage on a massive scale. You've trusted this man with everything." "Everything?" Eduardo admitted, a bitter edge to his voice. "He handles our accounts, drafts our contracts. We've built this business together." Pablo nodded. "If Hugo's planning what you suspect, he's likely covered his tracks well. But no one's perfect. I'll dig into his financials, offshore activity, recent communications. If he's guilty, we'll find it." Eduardo exhaled, relieved. "Do it quickly. The deal we're about to close. It's the biggest one we've ever signed. If Hugo's manipulating it, I need to know before it's too late." Pablo left with a determination Eduardo had always admired in him, and Eduardo threw himself into his usual work. He greeted Hugo warmly at their midday meeting, pretending nothing was amiss. Hugo, as always, was jovial and confident, though Eduardo noticed something he hadn't before, a subtle tension, a flicker of unease when Eduardo mentioned reviewing the contract details again. It was a small crack in Hugo's facade, but Eduardo latched onto it. By the end of the week, Pablo returned with a thick folder of evidence. Eduardo's heart sank as Pablo laid out the findings on the table in the privacy of Eduardo's home office. "Hugo's been embezzling funds for at least 2 years, Pablo began, flipping through documents. He's set up a network of offshore accounts to siphon money without raising alarms. The sums are staggering, millions, and that's not all." He pushed another set of papers toward Eduardo. "These are drafts of the contracts for your upcoming deal. He's manipulated key clauses to give himself majority control of the company once the deal is signed. It's subtle, but if this goes through, he could push you out entirely." Eduardo stared at the documents, his chest tightening with a mix of rage and disbelief. The man he had trusted like a brother had been plotting against him all along. "Does he think I wouldn't notice?" Eduardo muttered, more to himself than to Pablo. "He likely assumes you wouldn't. Or if you did, it'd be too late to stop him," Pablo replied. "But now you know. What's the plan?" Eduardo clenched his fists. He wanted nothing more than to confront Hugo immediately, but his instincts told him to play this carefully. Hugo was dangerous. He wouldn't have taken this risk without contingencies. "I need time," Eduardo said. "I'll act as if everything is normal while we dismantle his plan from the inside. Can you dig deeper into his offshore accounts? I need to know exactly where that money is going." Pablo nodded. "Consider it done. But be careful, Eduardo. If he catches wind that you're onto him, things could escalate." Eduardo nodded, his jaw tight. "I won't give him the satisfaction. He thinks he's playing chess with me, but I'll checkmate him before he knows the game's begun." That evening, Eduardo couldn't shake the weight of what he'd learned. As he poured himself a glass of scotch, he thought of Camilla. She had risked her job, her peace of mind, to warn him about Hugo. Without her courage, he would have walked into a trap blind. The next day, Eduardo returned to the restaurant. Camilla's face turned pale when she saw him, as if expecting bad news. "I need to talk to you," Eduardo said, his voice steady but serious. She followed him to a quiet corner, wringing her hands nervously. "Was I wrong?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "No," Eduardo said, meeting her eyes. "You were right. Hugo's been stealing from me for years. You may have saved my company." Camilla blinked, relief and disbelief washing over her. I'm glad I could help. I didn't know what else to do." "You did more than enough," Eduardo said, "but this isn't over yet. If you're willing, I might need your help again." Her brows furrowed, but she nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." Eduardo smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. The betrayal still burned, but for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. With Camilla's integrity and Pablo's skill, he had allies in this fight. And Hugo, no matter how clever he thought he was, would soon learn that Eduardo was not a man to be underestimated. The morning sun filtered through Eduardo's office windows, casting long shadows across his polished desk. Hugo entered with his usual swagger, his smile sharp and calculated. Eduardo stood, extending his hand as though nothing were amiss, but the grip he offered was firm, almost confrontational. "Morning," Hugo said, easing into the chair across from Eduardo. "You look tense, my friend. All good?" "Just the weight of the deal," Eduardo replied, forcing a calm demeanor. "You know how it is. These things can make or break us." Hugo chuckled, a practiced sound of camaraderie. "Don't worry, we've got this in the bag." Eduardo leaned back, studying the man before him. The betrayal still felt raw, like an open wound, but he buried his emotions. This wasn't the time to show his hand. "I've been reviewing the final contract again," Eduardo said, his voice casual but probing. "There are some clauses I'd like to clarify, just minor details." Hugo's expression flickered, a brief tightening of his jaw that Eduardo wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't been looking for it. But the mask returned just as quickly. "Of course," Hugo said, his tone easy. "Send it over, and I'll walk you through it." "I'd rather do it together," Eduardo replied. No room for misunderstandings. Hugo's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Eduardo could feel the tension building, a game of chess where each move mattered. But this was just the beginning. That evening, Eduardo invited Hugo to his penthouse, a tradition for celebrating milestones. The atmosphere was warm, the wine flowing as the two reminisced about their early days in business. Eduardo played the part perfectly, amiable, trusting, as though nothing had changed. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Eduardo asked, swirling his glass. "From those cramped offices to this?" "All the time," Hugo said, raising his glass. "We built this together. No one else could have done it." "Together," Eduardo echoed, his gaze sharp despite the pleasant tone. "That's what I always believed." Hugo hesitated, sensing the shift in the conversation. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eduardo set his glass down, leaning forward. "I've been hearing things, Hugo. Things that don't sit well with me." "What are you talking about?" Hugo asked, his voice steady but his eyes narrowing. "Offshore accounts, manipulated contracts, millions of dollars unaccounted for." Eduardo's voice was calm, but the words hit like hammers. "You want to explain that?" Hugo stiffened, the easy charm slipping away. "Eduardo, you're not making sense. Where's this coming from?" "I think you know exactly where it's coming from," Eduardo said. "I trusted you. You were my brother. And this is how you repay me." Hugo's expression hardened, his facade of innocence crumbling. "You don't understand. This is business. You think I enjoyed doing this? It's survival, strategy." "Strategy," Eduardo spat, rising from his chair. "You call stabbing me in the back strategy?" Hugo stood as well, his posture defiant. "Don't act like you're so righteous. You know how this world works. You're either the predator or the prey. I made my choice." For a moment, the room was heavy with silence. Eduardo stared at Hugo, the man he had once considered closer than family, now a stranger. "You made your choice," Eduardo said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "And now you'll live with the consequences." Hugo scoffed, his confidence returning. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do? I've covered my tracks. You don't have proof." Eduardo smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You underestimated me, Hugo. That was your first mistake." Hugo's arrogance faltered as Eduardo stepped closer. "I've frozen your accounts. Those offshore havens of yours, gone. The contracts you manipulated, nullified. And the board, they know everything." The color drained from Hugo's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Eduardo's voice was cold now, each word deliberate. "I've got everything I need to destroy you. Financially, legally, professionally. You won't just lose the company. You'll lose your freedom." Hugo's composure shattered. "You can't do this to me." "I didn't do this," Eduardo snapped. "You did. You dug this grave. Now lie in it." Hugo's defiance crumbled into desperation. "Eduardo, listen. We can fix this. Let me make it right." "There's nothing to fix," Eduardo said, turning his back on him. "You're done." Hours later, Hugo was escorted out of the company's headquarters, under the watchful eyes of Eduardo's legal team. Eduardo stood by the window of his office, watching as his former partner disappeared into the night. The betrayal still stung, but there was a grim satisfaction in knowing justice had been served. He owed much of this to Pablo's thoroughness and Camila's bravery. Without them, he might have been another victim of Hugo's greed. As Eduardo sat down, the weight of the day finally hit him. The company was safe for now, but the cost had been steep. He had lost a friend, a brother, but perhaps that bond had been an illusion all along. The only way forward was to rebuild, stronger than before, and Eduardo would ensure no one ever had the power to betray him again. The office was unusually quiet as Eduardo walked through the hallways of his company the following morning. Though Hugo's abrupt removal had been carefully managed, whispers still lingered among the staff. Eduardo didn't acknowledge them. His focus was singular, repairing the damage and ensuring Hugo's schemes were dismantled completely. In his office, Pablo waited with another stack of documents. The investigator's sharp eyes betrayed a mixture of urgency and satisfaction. "We've confirmed the extent of Hugo's network," Pablo began, spreading papers across the desk. "The offshore accounts are frozen, as we planned. His assets are locked, and the authorities are prepared to investigate further." Eduardo nodded, his jaw tight. "And the contracts? Are they clean now?" Pablo tapped a document. "Your legal team moved quickly. The board approved the revisions this morning. Hugo's manipulation is completely erased. You're back in control." Relief washed over Eduardo, but only briefly. "Good, but I know Hugo. He won't accept this quietly." "You're right," Pablo said grimly. "He's already making moves. We intercepted an email he sent to a reporter trying to spin his removal as a smear campaign. He's trying to weaponize your past." Eduardo frowned. His past wasn't spotless. Few successful entrepreneurs were, but he had nothing to hide that could ruin him. Still, Hugo was crafty. "Let him try," Eduardo said finally. "If he wants to play dirty, I'll make sure he's buried under his own lies." Later that day, Eduardo convened a meeting with his most trusted team members. The atmosphere was tense but resolute as he outlined the company's immediate priorities. "We've been blindsided," Eduardo admitted. But we're not victims. This company stands because of all of you, your hard work, your loyalty. Hugo underestimated us, and now it's time to show him what happens when you cross this team. There were nods around the table, a fire igniting in the room. Eduardo could see the determination in their faces. And we're not just cleaning up his mess, Eduardo continued. We're moving forward, stronger, smarter. From this point on, every decision we make protects what we've built. The team dispersed, invigorated. Eduardo lingered, his mind already calculating the next steps. He had taken control back, but rebuilding trust, internally and externally, would be a battle. Hugo's counterattack came swiftly. The next morning, a headline splashed across business news sites. Corporate coup, Eduardo's empire built on lies. The article cited vague allegations of financial impropriety, anonymous sources claiming Eduardo had manipulated contracts, and an unnamed insider, clearly Hugo, accusing him of unethical practices. Eduardo read the article with calm precision, his fury simmering beneath the surface. He immediately called a meeting with his PR team. "Address this head-on," he instructed. "Issue a statement denying the claims, but keep it professional. Hugo's lies won't hold up under scrutiny, and I don't want to stoop to his level." The team got to work, crafting a response that emphasized transparency and integrity. Meanwhile, Eduardo reached out to key clients and stakeholders, assuring them of the company's stability and providing proof of Hugo's schemes. That evening, as Eduardo reviewed the day's progress, his phone buzzed. It was Camilla. "Mr. Eduardo, I think I saw Hugo at the restaurant tonight," she said, her voice tense. "He was meeting with someone, but I couldn't hear much." Eduardo's pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" "Something about finding a loophole and lawyers." He looked desperate. Eduardo thanked her, his mind racing. Hugo wasn't giving up. If he was searching for a loophole, he might have missed something. Something Eduardo needed to catch first. "Camilla," he said after a pause, "I need you to keep an eye on him. I'll send someone to protect you if necessary, but anything you overhear could be critical." "I'll do my best," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. The next few days were a whirlwind. Eduardo's team worked tirelessly to reinforce the company's legal protections and track Hugo's moves. Pablo's investigations revealed Hugo was indeed trying to exploit an obscure clause in a subsidiary's contract, one that could grant him partial access to a key asset. "We caught it in time," Pablo reported. "But he's relentless. He's even trying to bribe some of your staff for information." Eduardo's face darkened. "Enough is enough. File the lawsuit. I want him stopped completely." The legal team acted swiftly, filing a comprehensive lawsuit against Hugo for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The case was airtight, bolstered by the evidence Pablo had gathered. Within days, the court froze Hugo's remaining assets, cutting off his resources entirely. Hugo's final attempt to regain control came in the form of a desperate meeting request. Eduardo agreed, but only out of curiosity. They met in a sterile conference room, the air thick with tension. "You've made your point," Hugo began, his arrogance now replaced with bitterness. "But this doesn't have to end like this. We can settle, quietly." Eduardo leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Settle? After everything you've done? After the lies, the theft, the betrayal?" "I made mistakes," Hugo admitted, his tone pleading now. "But you're not perfect either. We both know that." "You're right," Eduardo said, his voice calm but cold. "I'm not perfect, but I don't destroy the people I care about for personal gain." Hugo's face twisted in frustration. "You can't just erase me." "You erased yourself," Eduardo said, standing. "This conversation is over. Good luck finding someone else to trust you after this." Hugo sat frozen as Eduardo walked out, his head held high. The victory was bittersweet, but it was final. Hugo's schemes had been dismantled, his reputation ruined. Eduardo returned to his office that evening, exhausted but resolute. He poured himself a drink and looked out at the city skyline. The betrayal had cost him more than he cared to admit, but it had also taught him a lesson he would never forget. Trust was the most valuable currency in business and in life, and he would never again give it so freely. For now, the future was his to rebuild, and this time he would ensure it was built on unshakable foundations. The weeks following Hugo's downfall brought a mix of relief and unease to Eduardo's life. The company was stabilizing thanks to his swift actions, but the scars of betrayal lingered. The whispers within the office had quieted, replaced by a cautious optimism. Still, Eduardo knew this was only the beginning of his path to rebuilding. One afternoon, Eduardo returned to the restaurant where everything had started. The place felt different now, no longer just a setting for business deals, but a turning point in his life. Camilla greeted him with a hesitant smile, as though unsure if her role in his saga was finished. "Camilla," Eduardo said, his tone warm. "Can we talk?" She nodded, her curiosity evident. After her shift ended, they sat in a quiet booth. Eduardo explained how Hugo's schemes had been unraveled and the measures he had taken to safeguard the company. Camilla listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to relief. "I owe you a debt of gratitude," Eduardo said. "If you hadn't spoken up, I might have walked into a trap I couldn't escape." "I just did what felt right," Camilla said. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone would have risked their job to warn a stranger," Eduardo replied. "Your courage made all the difference." Camilla blushed, unsure how to respond. "I was wondering," Eduardo continued, "if you'd consider joining my team." Her eyes widened. "Me? I don't know anything about your business." "Maybe not yet," Eduardo admitted, "but I see potential in you. You're sharp, resourceful, and ethical, qualities that are hard to find. I could teach you the rest." Camilla hesitated, torn between her comfort zone and the opportunity of a lifetime. "It's a lot to think about," she said honestly. "Take your time," Eduardo said, sliding a card across the table. "If you decide to take a leap, call me. We'll make it work." A week later, Camilla walked into Eduardo's office, nervous but resolute. She had taken his offer and now found herself immersed in a world she barely understood. At first, the pace was overwhelming: contracts, reports, and endless meetings. But Eduardo was patient, guiding her through the complexities with steady encouragement. Camilla quickly proved her worth. Her fresh perspective often highlighted solutions that others overlooked. In one instance, she noticed a minor inconsistency in a supplier contract that could have led to significant losses. Eduardo was impressed, and so was the rest of the team. "She's got a knack for this," Pablo said during a meeting. "You've found yourself a hidden gem." Eduardo couldn't help but agree. Camilla's growth was remarkable. As she gained confidence, her voice became a valuable addition to discussions, and her contributions began shaping decisions. But success didn't come without challenges. One of Eduardo's competitors, keen to exploit his recent troubles, launched an aggressive bid to poach a key client. The situation demanded a bold strategy, and Eduardo decided to involve Camilla. "This is your chance to lead," Eduardo told her, handing her the details of the client's concerns. "Convince them we're the better choice." Camilla stared at the file, nerves clawing at her confidence. "What if I mess this up?" "Then we learn and try again," Eduardo said with a reassuring smile. "But I don't think you will." The meeting was tense, the client skeptical, but Camilla approached it with a mix of honesty and determination. She didn't just pitch the company's strengths, she addressed their weaknesses and outlined steps to improve. By the end of the conversation, the client was not only convinced, but impressed. When she returned to the office, Eduardo greeted her with a rare grin. "You did it." Camilla beamed, the weight of doubt lifting from her shoulders. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. As weeks turned into months, Camilla's role continued to grow. Eduardo entrusted her with more responsibilities, including leading a project to expand into international markets. The challenge was daunting, involving cultural barriers, financial hurdles, and untested strategies. But Camilla tackled it head-on, driven by the belief that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Eduardo watched her progress with pride. Camilla wasn't just thriving, she was transforming. And in her, Eduardo saw a reflection of his own journey, a story of perseverance, ambition, and reinvention. The company was evolving, and so was Eduardo. For the first time since Hugo's betrayal, he felt a spark of hope, not just for the business, but for the people who made it strong. As Eduardo and Camilla stood in the bustling office late one evening, reviewing the details of her international project, Eduardo said, "You've come a long way, Camilla. I'm proud of you." Camilla smiled, the weight of her journey reflected in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." Eduardo shook his head. "You've done more than you realize, and I think you're just getting started." The turning point had come, not just for Eduardo, but for Camilla too. Together, they were shaping a future neither of them could have imagined. And this was only the beginning. The first day of the international project launch felt like the start of a marathon. Camilla stood at the front of the conference room, a stack of documents in hand, surrounded by senior executives, foreign market advisors, and financial analysts. Eduardo, seated at the table, offered a slight nod of encouragement as the room quieted. "This expansion represents a bold step forward for our company," Camilla began, her voice steady but firm. "But bold doesn't mean reckless. To succeed, we need to understand the nuances of these markets. What works here might not work there. That's where we'll innovate." Her words carried confidence, but inside she felt the weight of expectation. This was her chance to prove herself not just as a quick learner, but as a leader. Over the next hour, she presented a comprehensive strategy that blended data-driven insights with cultural adaptability. The room buzzed with approval as she concluded, and Eduardo's smile reassured her that she had delivered. But the real work was just beginning. Camilla dove into the complexities of the project with relentless determination. The task was daunting, launching the company into markets with unfamiliar regulations, cultural nuances, and stiff competition. Every day presented a new challenge, a legal hurdle in one country, a logistical snag in another. But Camilla refused to back down. Eduardo remained a steadfast mentor, offering advice without micromanaging. "Trust your instincts," he told her during a late-night strategy session. "You've got the vision. Don't let the obstacles cloud it." Camilla took his words to heart. When a distributor in Asia pulled out at the 11th hour, she worked tirelessly to secure a replacement, leveraging her growing network and negotiating skills. When a cultural misunderstanding threatened to derail a marketing campaign in Europe, she consulted local experts and reworked the entire strategy overnight. Each victory brought her closer to the team's respect and the project's success. And with each setback, she grew stronger, learning not just about international business, but about herself. One evening, as Camilla prepared for a major presentation to secure funding from an influential foreign investor, Eduardo stopped by her office. She was surrounded by charts and projections, her focus intense, but her exhaustion evident. "You've been at this for hours," Eduardo said, placing a coffee cup on her desk. "Take a breath." Camilla looked up, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "This investor could make or break the project. I can't afford to mess it up." "You won't," Eduardo said. "You've already proven you can handle anything. This is just another step." Camila smiled faintly, his confidence in her lifting her spirits. Thanks. I don't want to let you down. You've never let me down, Eduardo said firmly. And you won't start now. The next day, Camila delivered a flawless pitch. The investor was impressed not just by the potential profitability, but by her vision and conviction. By the end of the meeting, the deal was secured, marking a significant milestone in the project. When Camila returned to the office, Eduardo greeted her with applause. You've outdone yourself again, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. Thank you, Camila said, her smile wide. But it's a team effort. Eduardo chuckled. That's true. But a great team needs a great leader, and that's what you've become. As the months passed, the project neared its completion. The company's presence in new markets was becoming a reality, and Camila's role as a leader was cemented. She had gone from an outsider to a driving force in the company's success. But success wasn't without its challenges. The stress took its toll. Long hours, difficult negotiations, and the constant pressure to perform. One evening, Eduardo found her sitting alone in the office, staring at a list of unresolved issues. You can't do everything on your own, Eduardo said, sitting beside her. Trust your team, delegate. Camila sighed. I know, but this project feels personal. I want it to succeed, not just for the company, but for everyone who believed in me. It's personal for me too, Eduardo said softly, but success isn't about carrying the weight alone. It's about building something together. And you've already done that. His words resonated with her, and slowly she began to trust her team more, leaning on their expertise while focusing on the bigger picture. The project started moving at a smoother pace, and Camila found a rhythm that balanced ambition with sustainability. The day of the official international launch was met with celebration. Eduardo and Camila stood together at the podium during the press event, the room filled with journalists, partners, and employees. This expansion isn't just about business growth, Eduardo said during his speech. It's about vision, resilience, and the belief that with the right people, anything is possible. He turned to Camila. One of those people is Camila, who has been instrumental in making this happen. Her leadership and determination are a testament to what can be achieved when you refuse to let limitations define you. Camila stepped forward, the applause ringing in her ears. She addressed the audience with heartfelt words about teamwork, perseverance, and the power of opportunity. As she spoke, she realized she had found her place, not just in the company, but in her own story. Later, as the event wound down, Eduardo raised a toast to her. To Camila, he said, his voice warm, for proving that courage and integrity can take you further than anyone expects. Camila clinked her glass with his, the weight of her journey settling into something lighter. She had risen, not just in her career, but in her belief in herself. And as she looked at Eduardo, she knew they were just getting started. The international expansion had transformed the company. Eduardo's vision and Camila's leadership had propelled them into new markets, earning accolades and record-breaking revenue. But beyond the numbers, the journey had reshaped them both in profound ways. Eduardo stood in his office one evening, the lights of the city stretching into the horizon. It had been months since Hugo's betrayal, and while the pain of losing someone he once considered a brother still lingered, it no longer consumed him. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the growth that adversity had forced upon him. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Camila entered carrying a folder and her ever-present determination. The final reports from the expansion, she said, handing him the document. Everything looks solid. Eduardo flipped through the pages, nodding. You've exceeded every expectation, Camila. This company wouldn't be where it is without you. Camila hesitated, then spoke. And it wouldn't be here without you, Eduardo. You trusted me when no one else would have. You gave me a chance to prove myself. You earned it, Eduardo said, setting the report down. And you've shown everyone that success isn't about where you start. It's about what you're willing to fight for. Camilla smiled, but there was a hint of something deeper in her expression. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. How many people out there don't get the chance I did? How many could be just as capable if someone gave them an opportunity? Eduardo leaned back, considering her words. You're right. There's talent everywhere, but not everyone gets to showcase it. What if we could change that? Camilla asked, her eyes lighting up. We've already proven that taking risks on people can lead to incredible results. What if we started a mentorship program? Something that helps people like me, people who might not have the perfect resume, but have the drive and potential to succeed. Eduardo's lips curved into a slow smile. A mentorship program, he repeated. I like it, but why stop there? Let's expand it. Scholarships, training programs, partnerships with underserved communities. Let's create something that transforms lives. Camilla's excitement grew. We could call it the Resilience Initiative. It would make it about overcoming obstacles, just like we did. Eduardo nodded. And not just in business. Let's focus on people's stories. Help them see that their struggles don't define them. Over the following months, Eduardo and Camilla worked tirelessly to build the program. They partnered with schools, community organizations, and other companies, creating opportunities for people from all walks of life. Eduardo used his network to secure funding, while Camilla became the face of the initiative, traveling to speak at events and inspire others with her story. The program quickly gained traction, becoming a movement that extended far beyond their company. Eduardo and Camilla found themselves in rooms with policymakers and global leaders, advocating for a more inclusive future. One evening, after returning from a mentorship event, Eduardo and Camilla shared a quiet moment in his office. Did you ever imagine we'd be doing this? Eduardo asked, a trace of wonder in his voice. Camilla shook her head, her smile soft. Not in a million years, but I'm glad we are. It feels right. Eduardo raised his glass in a toast. To resilience, and to proving that with the right people by your side, anything is possible. Camilla clinked her glass with his, the weight of their journey lifting as they looked ahead. Months later, as Eduardo addressed a packed auditorium at the launch of the Resilience Initiative's global expansion, he reflected on how far they had come. He spoke about betrayal, growth, and the power of reinvention, his voice filled with conviction. The greatest lesson I've learned, Eduardo said, his gaze sweeping the audience, is that resilience isn't just about bouncing back. It's about transforming, about taking the hardest hits and using them to build something stronger. He looked toward Camilla, seated in the front row, her presence a testament to that very truth. This program isn't just about creating opportunities, Eduardo continued. It's about proving that no matter where you start or what you face, you can rise above it. Together, we're building a future where potential is the only thing that matters. The audience erupted into applause, but Eduardo's focus remained on Camilla. Her journey had inspired this, and in many ways, it had inspired him to become the leader and the person he was today. As they stood together after the event, Eduardo turned to Camilla. We've come a long way. And we're just getting started, Camilla replied with a grin. The two of them looked out at the bustling crowd, filled with people who had once doubted their own worth, but now saw a future filled with possibility. Together, Eduardo and Camilla had not just rebuilt their company, they had created a legacy of hope and transformation, proving that the greatest successes are born from the hardest challenges. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.